Good morning, everybody. Welcome to very stimulating keynote speeches by Mary Fulbrook and by Jan Thomas Groß. We got a lot of stimulating inspirations, I think, and we will discuss them over the next 2 days. Today we will have a very long day. We will have 5 panels and a film evening. We have a strict schedule, and I ask the chairs and all the speakers to stick to the time limit, please. It is still possible to sign up for the film. You have just to write an email to our conference address. You find the address and all the other informations on our website. And I now hand over to Raphael Utz, the chair of the first panel. Please.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Sibylle. Thank you very much, Hana, Ido, and Simon for your wonderful presentations, which I'm sure all of you who are watching have seen. At first, I'm going to say a few words about these presentations to remind us all what we're discussing, and then we shall move to a general discussion about these 3 very interesting papers. So Ido de Haan focused on obviously the Dutch case, and one of his, I think, catchphrases was that he talked about an internal Cold War within Dutch society about how to deal with the Holocaust, which led to fragmentation of Holocaust memory, which he then turned back for the period of the mid-60s, when he explored the conditions under which a new and unified way of commemoration and Holocaust memory emerged. And one of the key moments in this was the publication of a book, which I'm sure we're going to talk about a little more, by Jacques Bresser, Ondergang, the Downfall. He also pointed to the continued influence of the Cold War, particularly in relation to the conflict in the Middle East and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in particular, and diagnosed a multi-directional memory of the Holocaust which emerged during the period of the Cold War in the Netherlands. Simon Perego discussed the myth of silence as a myth and as a subject for historical investigation. He addressed the question of how do historians now discover presence in what had been diagnosed by earlier historians as absence in public discourse. And he then told us about a genealogy of historical research leading to his criticism of what he calls the emergence theory, so that a particular form of Holocaust memory emerged at a certain point in time without, as if it had never been there before. And in contrast, he points to the Parisian Jewish community's activities, which held in the period between 1945 and 1967 regular and numerous ceremonies of commemoration and events in which the Cold War was not an obstacle to Holocaust memory, but in fact a driving force, because the very diversity of the Parisian Jewish community and their ceremonies highlighted conflicts among them quite along the lines of the systemic divide dividing Europe and the wider world. And he concluded with the statement that the Holocaust was never kept quiet, but very openly discussed, precisely because of these reasons, in the Jewish community of Paris. I'm sure we will take things from there a little further later on. And Hana Kubátová turned things around by discussing absence as a form of presence, and terming avoidance strategies as a perhaps legitimate but certainly problematic response to experiences. So that the fact that there were avoidance strategies point to the fact that it was actually very present. She discussed the beautiful film The Shop on Main Street, taking this as an example for a concept of the Holocaust as intimate history. And I'd like to call it local history as well, so that the Holocaust, as she said, did not happen to Slovakia, but it happened in Slovakia, leaving lasting and deep imprints on all inhabitants at the time. She also pointed to the interesting fact that at least until 1949, there was no absence of Jewish voices. And she hinted at the role of Jewish voices as an opposition, as an alternative narrative, perhaps not only in relation to the Holocaust, but as an alternative and opposition narrative to the communist hegemonial narrative about history. And this, I'm sure, is something we're going to explore a little further. I would like to begin perhaps by asking a very general question. Now, starting from Hana's statement about the Holocaust as intimate and as local history, which of course is deeply relevant for all Eastern European countries, and Poland obviously in particular, and Ukraine. But of course, there is always a local dimension to the Holocaust everywhere. I mean, in France and in the Netherlands, there were neighbors. And so the question is, coming back to the title of our panel, Societies, what happened afterwards, precisely in this context? How did the dimension of neighborhood play out? How was the integration after the war of returnees? Simon mentioned the great diversity of the Parisian Jewish community. And one of the things I think which would be very interesting here, especially in the Dutch and the French case, is the question of restitution of property. So perhaps if I could ask you three to say a few things about this. Ido, would you perhaps like to start?
That's okay. Thank you, Raphael, for this introduction, and for also, of course, for the invitation to participate in this exciting conference. If you talk about the local dimension of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, it's first of all the local dimension of the city of Amsterdam. Actually, the street where I'm sitting now, it is the Pythagorasstraat in the east. I think half of the houses was inhabited by Jews, and so there are about 40 families that were deported from this street where I am at this moment. So that's if you talk about the local dimension, that is the experience of neighbors is very close by. The Jewish community in Amsterdam was decimated, and also their houses were empty. So large chunks of the city, of the inner city, were actually empty places and also demolished, because at the end of the war there was a shortage of fuel for heating. So a lot of the houses were demolished as well. And that's remained the situation until the late 1960s, mainly because of all the plans to do something with that empty heart of the city led to a lot of controversy. So it was a very visible mark, emptiness in the city. If you talk about the way in which people dealt with that, of course, very controversial process of restitution. In fact, very little was actually restituted, not just in material goods, but also in terms of financial assets. And that was the reason for that was a lot of resistance from the people who had profited from that. Even the Amsterdam Stock Exchange was at one moment stopped because the traders refused to return the things that said the assets that were not theirs. It's all very controversial. I think maybe a third element here in terms of the local experience is the experience of actual commemoration. That is what I talk about in my paper. And that is the commemoration of the strike of February. That was mainly in Amsterdam history. So February 1941, Amsterdam workers rose up against the German occupying forces in protest against the deportation of some 429 Jews from the city. And that was in response to a series of fightings and things that were going on in the city. So the city of Amsterdam was very unruly in that period. And the strike of Perego was a sort of turning point also in that history. That was something that was commemorated extensively, but very controversially because of the different voices. And that maybe then another aspect that we might want to talk about. I do think the Cold War was also a domestic war, and it's interesting to see also for the French and Slovak case how that domestic dimension of the Cold War played a role here.
Right. Simon, would you like to continue, perhaps?
Thank you very much, Raphael, for this very interesting question, because indeed the Holocaust was an intimate and local event, but Holocaust commemoration as well, and reintegration of Jewish communities after the war was also a very intimate and local question. Regarding integration, you mentioned the question of restitution, and you also mentioned this very important term, neighbors. For Parisian Jews, rebuilding lives after the Holocaust was first a question of housing. You had to find a house to rebuild your life, and if possible, to find your former house that you had left because of deportation, of fleeing into the southern zone or abroad. And most of the times, neighbors had taken the apartments because it was a better apartment or a way to enlarge your place. And there was a lot of conflicts on the ground level, on the very local level, between former Jewish inhabitants and non-Jews. Many researchers are working on this conflictual social interaction in France. I'm thinking of Sarah Gainsbourger, that some of you know, Isabelle Bacouche, and there is a very dynamic group in Paris working on this crossing of urban history and post-war Jewish history with urban and social history tools. And I think that it is a very stimulating way to approach this question of reintegration. Regarding commemoration and Jewish commemoration that I have been studied for a long time now, actually it was also an intimate activity, and face-to-face interaction between Jews and non-Jews, sometimes because non-Jews were invited, but also because Jewish commemorations were held in public spaces, and on pictures you can see people on the street looking, stopping in their walk to look what was happening. It's very hard to document, to know what all these people would have thought about these Jewish rituals in the street. But these rituals were also held in public venues, in theaters, in all the neighborhoods where mostly East European Jews were living. And this was part of the neighborhood life. People knew when there were 3,000 Jews attending a Warsaw Ghetto Uprising commemoration in the local theater. This was a public event also for non-Jews living around. And I think that one of my conclusions is that even for the post-war period, it's important to take into consideration the place, the role played by non-Jews in the Jewish commemorative activity, sometimes with good intention and sometimes not. Some Jewish commemorations were interrupted by insults or shouts. This also happened in cemeteries, for instance, in the Père Lachaise cemetery that some of you may know. So thank you for this question and asking us about this intimate dimension of also of commemoration.
Hana. Of course, restitution is a bit of a, you mentioned that in your talk already, that obviously with the communist takeover in 48, things took on a very different pattern. But perhaps you would still like to say a few things about this and about other aspects of this intimate post-history.
Yes, thank you. I also want to start with just a short thank you for inviting me and for the very generous kind of introduction to this panel. I think it is at the core of the memory of the Holocaust in post-war Slovakia or Czechoslovakia. And in my particular case study, looking at Slovakia in general and Eastern Slovakia in particular, the connection between memory and restitution that has been explored by authors like Dan Diner is a very explicit one. The defining of place to be neighbors again was very much connected with not only what people knew and what they were witnesses of, but whether they can be neighbors again if the wrongs were not corrected. And what I have explored and looked at is how the different individuals, groups, and communities have looked at what is actually wrongdoing, what is the harm that has been done, and how facilitating that, or at least accepting that it had happened, was an important point in making Slovaks and Jews neighbors again. Scholars have explored how the return of Jewish survivors and their claims of Jewish properties to be returned have triggered violence. But it has also triggered a very kind of organizational response from the side of the state to hinder any attempts of restitution. But from the part of many of the Jewish communities or individuals that stood in charge of Jewish organizations in post-war Slovakia, they have very openly and very actively, I believe, challenged the narrative that post-war Slovakia was presenting itself as a state of resistance and courage, in the name of the Slovak national uprising. And they have not only positioned themselves that they have also fought in the uprising and hence should be included in the post-war Slovak community, but also that before doing so and before Slovakia can go on, that there was something that happened during the war And that had to do with the looting of Jewish property, which was a very intimate process as well. Because if the large properties were taken by those in the highest echelons of the party, the small properties in the towns that also the movie looks at, the shop on Main Street, these were taken by their neighbors. The Jewish belongings, the little things in the household that maybe did not have a monetary value, but that had a very intimate value, were taken by people they knew by their name. That many often now stood in the commissions of post-war Slovakia or Czechoslovakia. And this is what has been, for me, maybe surprisingly, but very openly challenged also in the kind of institutional documents that the post-war communities handed over to the Czechoslovak or Slovak authorities, in which they were saying, you know, the Slovaks were responsible for the looting, and because they were responsible, they should give it back. So in my paper, I just tried to, as you said in the introduction nicely, you know, look at it from a different perspective. If not, can we understand some of the avoidance strategies to introduce a restitution law, for instance, as also a way, as a response to the fact that there was knowledge that the process of looting was intimate, and that there were voices and witnesses of the events that understood that there was harm committed, that felt that there was knowledge that wrong has been done in the past. So I do believe that in the Slovak example, especially, the connection between memory and restitution is a very close one.
Thank you very much. I see that we already have two questions put down in the chat, and I would encourage everyone to ask more questions. Before I take them up, let me just ask one more question to each of our panelists. And I think they are in many ways part of what emerges as one of the central themes, I think, for all three papers, which struck me when I listened to you, is that precisely when do we leave the intimate framework of returning, when do we talk to wider society, you know, beyond one city, beyond one neighborhood, beyond one small town, beyond immediate conflicts between certain individuals about restitution, for example? When do we enter into a larger social conversation, and under which conditions? And Ido, I mentioned earlier this book, which somehow seemed in your presentation to be a pivotal moment for that. And I think I noted down that this almost sounded as if compassion was rediscovered at this point. Can you tell us a little bit more about why did this book come about? What were the intentions and motives of the author, and how can you explain this very strong reaction? I mean, it's quite unique and remarkable that you have one book which changes so much.
Yeah, this is a very complicated question. I don't think that the publication of the book Ondergang, the English translation, was Ashes in the Wind, by Jacques Presser, historian at the University of Amsterdam, was the first moment that people actually discovered the history of the Jews. One of the remarkable things actually is that already before that book, several other books were published in the Netherlands that also had a wide distribution on the history of the Holocaust in the Netherlands, notably the book by Abel Hertzberg, that was published as part of a 4-volume commemorative book published by rather official people, so to say. So that the complete Dutch elite contributed to that book on the history of the Netherlands in the Second World War, and the account of Herzberg was part of that large book. So it was a story that was already there. People were aware of it. It was discussed. It was widely distributed. The important new thing of Presser was that he very deliberately and explicitly stated that he wanted to give Jews a voice in this history, and that was something that was largely missing. It was a history that was mainly told as something that came from the outside, Germans invading the country and persecuting Jews, but not something that was told from the experience of the Jews. The history of the book itself, or how it is published, is complicated. So in 1945, the journalist and historian Louis de Jong, who was in London during the war, had been able to escape to London, and he was the important voice of Radio Orange, the Radio Oranje, the official broadcast company of the government in exile. He established the Dutch Institute of War Documentation, and the Dutch Institute of War Documentation immediately got a very important position in the commemoration of the Second World War and also of the Holocaust, and assigned books. So this was an assigned book already in 1955, I think. Presser started working on it, and after 5 years, he had a mental breakdown. He was unable to write that book. So in 1960, instead of a book, he published a very small novel about the camp Westerbork. It was a transit camp. And that was a sort of breakthrough for him to then write the actual book, which turned out to be a 2-volume, about 1,000 pages of the history of the Jews, written with the voice of the Jews. Why it had such a huge impact, and it had a huge impact. It sold, I think, 100,000 copies in 2 weeks or so. Mm-hmm. That has to do with a whole series of things that happened in the Netherlands at the same time, all related to issues of the war, collaboration, the Holocaust, and so it's you might say it's a perfect storm that occurred in the mid-60s in the Netherlands, in which this book then became such an important element.
Right, thank you. Simon.
Yes.
You have to switch your yeah.
Thank you. So part of my presentation was about criticizing the emphasis on turning points, but still there are some turning points. So, and some very important one. And I think that the question you're asking is very important, because by looking at the Jewish community, I certainly don't want people to think that such an intense involvement in Holocaust commemoration was the case for French society as a whole. And indeed, French society needed some cultural events to grasp with the Holocaust earlier than what we thought, but still, and to remain in the 60s, which are a very important time in France, and we can see that it's not only a French event. The reception of the deputy of Rolf Orchut is a very big deal. It shows us that, of course, Holocaust memory has been transnational from its start. But for François Azoulay, which I quoted in my presentation, it is the moment where Holocaust memory leaves the cultural sphere of books and movies and enters the public space, as in Habermas's definition of this public arena of conflict that characterize modern society. And indeed, Rolf Orhutz does not speak only about the Jewish experience. Of course, he speaks about Gentile and Christian responsibilities, and the French people as a mostly Christian collectivity was of course very intrigued by this play. So I think that literary events in the French case are certainly an important tool that helped the French public opinion to deal with the Holocaust. We can also quote the book of Jean-François Steiner, Treblinka, that was very well studied by Samuel Moyn. In this case, the question was not Jewish, non-Jewish relations, but the very core of the Jewish experience of the Holocaust in the mass killing centers and not in concentration camps or mixed camps like Auschwitz, which has both functions. Located his story at Treblinka, Jean-François Steiner exposed to the public, French public opinion, the very existence of these sites whose only function was mass extermination. So I can relate to Ido's presentation by insisting on literary events in the 60s.
Right. Hana, is that film perhaps that moment for Slovakia or Czechoslovakia?
Well, I was thinking this whole time that Simon and Ido were speaking about how can we define that, whether there was kind of a larger social debate in this period. And yes, maybe the political thought of the 1960s has brought some of the movies like The Shop on Main Street to light. And it has also kind of the reactions it triggered were a manifestation that there was a short-lived but still a possibility to discuss the issues that were at the core. And this was also perhaps what triggered some of the negative reactions to the movie in Czechoslovakia as opposed to the reactions to the movie from abroad. And of course, following, however, both Grossman's and Jan Kader's emigration, the movie was then in 1969 forbidden to be screened in Czechoslovakia. Maybe we can go even then further to speak about the late 1980s, when for the first time there was a declaration being put down by intellectuals, also members of the clergy then, which addressed what has happened in wartime Slovakia and has also very directly expressed sorrow what has happened. And this maybe was within the intellectual circus, but it was widely accepted as a first very public instance of when this was acknowledged on a more wider social level. So maybe that is the question of, because of how intimate and local the Holocaust was in Slovakia, and because of so much attention being then portrayed on the highest echelons of the party, like Josef Tiso, I think this has enabled the majority society to escape many of the kind of broader debates, because they had an individual in the name of the former president and priest around which to either kind of try to exempt from any of wrongdoings or to blame for anything that happened in the wartime state. And much of the debate has revolved and continues to revolve around his positions, his activities, not on kind of these local, more intimate, to come back to Natalia Alexiun's frame or coin, how she coined it, not on the intimate local aspects of what has happened. This does not mean that there were not instances, especially around the political thought, but I tried to manifest that they had some history as well, and that these are connected with some of the voices that were present, maybe tried to be silent, but were still present in post-war Slovakia.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions from other participants, and I will try and group them a little bit. I think the first one is to Ido and Simon, and this is about essentially what, when we start from the thought that the Cold War political divisions affected in what Ido has called the internal war, this internal civil war, affected Holocaust commemoration and Holocaust memory, and probably also Holocaust research. How did changes in that grander political alignments then make the discussion different? So, for example, when Simon told us about the various Jewish groups, the the Yiddish-speaking, but how did then the grander events of the Cold War and the political changes in Eastern Europe affect these debates and discussions in the Netherlands and in France? Any one of you who would like to start? Perhaps.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
I guess the main point there would be that after an initial sort of enthusiasm and support for the Communist Party in the immediate post-war period in the Netherlands, the communists were very soon marginalized, and that meant that the many people who were involved in commemorative activities, also Jews who were then also communists, were also marginalized, and that had a strong effect on the, especially on the way in which people dealt with the commemoration of Auschwitz. I have a story about the Auschwitz Committee that was established in the mid-50s in a very controversial episode. Controversial because basically the Dutch government forbade to have any context with Poland and to participate in commemorations in Auschwitz in Poland, because it was seen as all communist propaganda, basically. So that and that I would say that didn't change for the rest of the periods. And there was a question also about the Dutch communists and whether they didn't change their position in the 1960s. I'm afraid they did not. They were hardened Stalinist until the bitter end, I would say, even after 1989 and after the abolishment of the official Communist Party. That Stalinism was the thing, and it had all to do with the position of the leader, Paul de Groot, who was a staunch supporter of the harshest line. The interesting thing is that he was a Jew, and that he didn't want to talk about it for all of his life, and that is, of course, the tragedy of this story. That also people who had another story to tell. As Jews didn't do that because they thought that was subordinate to the history of the heroism of communist resistance.
Right. Simon?
Yes, actually there was kind of the same phenomenon in France, but with this slight difference that the French Communist Party was actually the first party as an electoral voice right after the war, and it was very popular among Eastern European Jews because of the contribution of Soviet Union, of course, in the defeat of Nazi Germany, and the role played by communist resistance in France, fighting against the Vichy regime and the German occupant. So there was also this marginality with the beginning of the Cold War of communists that were also very Stalinist in France, as in every communist party at the beginning of the 50s. But in the Jewish street, the influence of the Communist Party was strong enough to build a counter society. So, of course, communist Jews were marginalized, but they were strong enough to to act like a strong actor in the Jewish community. Regarding the events that influenced all these struggles, it's complicated because, of course, these events happen in Eastern Europe. The trial, the Prague trial, the doctor's plot, the fate of the Jews in Eastern Europe, their religious freedom, all these questions were discussed among the Jewish community and on the commemorative scene. But is it Cold War? Is it Cold War? Is it a Cold War struggle to denounce the assassination of the Yiddish poets in 1952? It could be seen as such, and this is what I decided to do, because it takes place in the global critique in the West of the Eastern regimes. But I think it's not as simple as that. I don't have an answer, but that's something I would like to throw and maybe discuss later. Is the question of anti-Semitism in the Eastern Bloc only a Cold War issue? And actually, many Jews that were criticizing Jewish communists for supporting a regime that were persecuting Jews took care of saying, we are not for or against the communist system. This is not our fight. Our fight is freedom and the well-being of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe. It's of course more complicated than that, but still that was their argument, and we need to hear it in this conference on Cold War. Are we always talking about Cold War? It's not that easy.
Yes, very, very interesting and good point. Hana, what about this sort of oppositional potential, let's put it very conservatively, of Jewish voices in Slovakia after 1949? Were they aware of that? Did they change their language? I mean, this of course is something which we see from very early on in the post-history of the Holocaust, that Jewish survivors change and adapt their language in order to be heard at all and in order to be part of a discourse. What's the story here in Slovakia and of the Jewish community there?
Yes, I think that after the attempts of having some restitution law adopted at all, which the Slovak representation fought against, I think we see an adaptation from, I don't know how much we can speak of a kind of coherent Jewish community voice as a single voice, but we do see an adaptation in a sense that there were attempts to make the Jewish participation in the Slovak national uprising visible. So once we see this kind of ritualization of the anti-fascist narrative become stronger, with now different players within the uprising being brought to light, not always in accordance to history, we do see that there were attempts of, being heard and visible in the kind of anti-fascist narrative as well, and challenge the idea that those Jews that were not in the territory of Slovakia, that they were, that they were still participating in the anti-fascist uprising, and they fought to be included as anti-fascist fighters because of their racial persecution, which might seem kind of crazy that they would need to acknowledge that, but I think this was part of the struggle to not be excluded from the anti-fascist heroic narrative, simply because many of them were closed by their own state and denounced by their own neighbors and held in concentration camps, labor camps within Slovakia or outside of Slovakia. So we do see, and if there is an avoidance strategy or kind of an adaptation strategy of, understanding and making their participation, their role in the anti-fascist struggle being visible and heard, taking part in the, official commemorations, writing letters to the official administration, and on the anniversaries also pointing those in charge to the Jewish role in anti-fascist resistance. They would write, names where individual Jews fought, which battalion they joined. They were very explicit in making names visible within the larger story of we are all anti-fascists.
Yes. I have two questions which I would like to clump together, perhaps a little unfairly. So there's one question about a commonality with all three presentations, that you all emphasize the very big, ambiguous and ambivalent effects of the Cold War on dealing with the Holocaust. So the question to all three of you is to elaborate a little bit more on this interesting interrelationship between marginalization on the one hand, visibility on the other, between silencing and active commemoration of the Holocaust. And quite the, from the other, seen from the other, from a completely different angle, is, were there any Jewish avoidance tactics? Were there things they did not feel able that they could speak about? So that perhaps this would be an inverse turning point, that there were certain things the Jewish communities did not want to discuss with wider society. Perhaps, Hana, you go first.
Maybe a little bit mentioned it in my earlier response, kind of the changing of, with the narratives changing, also the Jewish voices changed. There was what I'm trying to say, I think, is that there was a link between the different narratives and between the memories, or whether kind of communal or institutional, and that they kind of reacted to each other, that they were in some form of relation to each other, whether adverse or whether the opposite. Whether there were things that were still kind of avoided. I think that the larger narrative of the official narrative was never really challenged, in a sense that Slovakia presents itself as this country of anti-fascist, that there is this line now being drawn between kind of those that were radicals but never really somehow belonged to the nation now, but the majority, kind of the new Slovak, is the anti-fascist Slovak. And I think this was never really challenged, and in many of the, whether this was directly post-war aftermath documentation, or whether it was later on, kind of the heroic narrative was of course never really openly challenged, and is not challenged until today. So we can still treat the anniversary of the Slovak National Uprising as the most important national holiday, and it is also the holiday which is celebrated by the presidents with awarding of kind of medals. It is still kind of very embedded in how World War II history is being presented and this has never been really challenged, that the history of Slovakia in World War II is not only, to say, the history of the anti-fascist rebellion. So maybe this was always strong, and we see it in the institutional correspondence between the Jewish communities and the official authorities, in which the Jewish community is very careful in kind of not making generalizations. So when they would still appeal to restitution or to harm being committed, they would say, you know, the majority of Slovaks, of course, fought, but there were Slovaks who were active in the Hlinka party, and this needs to be acknowledged.
Right. Simon.
Thank you. Regarding the ambivalent effect of the Cold War, the late Professor David Cesarani had this interesting thought. He said in an article on a post-war British memory of the Holocaust that there was this curious phenomenon, I quote, whereby the Holocaust was simultaneously present and absent. It's a very simple observation, but fundamental. It helps to understand the complexity of the period of the early post-war period. And I think the Cold War has a lot to do in this ambivalence of absence and presence, because it depends on the side you are looking at. If you were willing to defend the Atlantic Alliance as a Western camp, it was not so easy to stress the responsibility of Germany in atrocities during the war. You needed an ally and not a former enemy to disregard. On the contrary, on the side that was supportive of Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, it was of course very useful to insist on what Nazi Germany had done to European people and also to the Jews. In these circumstances, the Communist Party in France did not forget the Jewish experience, because it was useful politically. So communist leaders attended Jewish ceremonies to express their solidarity. In the public discourse of the Communist Party, they didn't need as much to stress the Jewish experience, but they were talking about all the terrible things that Germany had done. So I think that the politicization of memory found its way in Holocaust memory with this confrontation of both sides using what they needed to use in the recent past. Regarding avoidance tactics, that's of course an important question. People working on the early post-war period, I think, are not trying to say that it was the same as today. It doesn't make any sense. Of course, the context was very different. Of course, everything that we say today about collaboration, for instance, in the Holocaust was not possible in the early 50s. For instance, within the French Jewish community, it was totally acceptable to talk about the responsibilities of Pétain, of Laval, and of the leadership of the Vichy regime, because everyone around in the French society, in the Communist Party, but also the Socialist Party, criticized, of course, the collaborators. So it was possible to denounce the leadership, but talking about the general population was more complicated. And here there is an avoidance tactic. You could denounce the leadership of the Vichy regime, but the French had helped the Jews. This was a common discourse. Before the emergence of the figure of the Just, the Right House among the nations, the French Jewish community did not need this commemorative tool coming from Israel to commemorate the saviors. There is a strong insistence on the help the Jews in France received from non-Jews, and I think it was part of an avoidance tactic to to avoid to tackle the question of denunciations, robbery, that was the responsibility of neighbors, because the Holocaust in France and in Paris was also an intimate event. Even if there was no mass killing, there was mass persecution.
Ido.
Yeah, so if you allow me, I only take the second half of your question. Also, because I want to say something about what Natalia asked about Jewish avoidance strategies. Hi, Natalia, good to see you. The Jewish community in the Netherlands after the war, first of all, was decimated, but it was also hugely divided. There was something that was already the case before the war, and one of the elements of the division was that the religious organizations, the rabbinical organizations, did not really want to interact too much, neither with the non-Jewish Dutch society, nor with the majority of the Jews, who were considered to be basically lost to assimilation. And so they wanted to keep the community pure, and therefore didn't do much in terms of interest representation for the Jewish community. And that was something that continued after the war. And the situation was worsened due to the fact that the Jewish organization of the Jewish community, the religious organization of the Jewish community, had to be restructured dramatically. And a lot of the communities were basically abolished and their properties were sold. And that put off a large number of surviving Jews in the various parts of the Netherlands, who basically were also then robbed of their possibility to convene, to come together. So there was a huge division, and that was then the third dimension. Zionism became way more important. And the ironical thing is that basically the Zionists in 1945 were the main people who were responsible for the rebuilding of the Jewish community in the Netherlands. They did that, and then after 4, 5, 6, 7 years, they went on Aliyah and then have left. As a result of that, the number of Jews that were a member of the community declined even more after the war. So of the 20,000 or so survivors, in the end only 5 or 6 remained within the official community. The main representative was the Jewish Social Work Organization, and that is still. I see we have to stop because of the time.
I'm afraid we have to leave it here. Thank you so much for your 3 wonderful presentations and this very interesting and illuminating discussion, which I think makes very clear how promising it is to look at this immediate post-war history and beyond through the lens of the Cold War. Thank you again. Thank you for all of those who asked questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to everyone and each and everyone in detail. Thank you, and I hand back to Hana Hecker